Hello, everyone. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up and coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. And in my humble opinion, one of the most slept upon and still underrated great films of the last 3 years remains Canadian writer director Chandler Levack's I Like Movies, a coming of age drama that follows the social and intimate struggles of a movie obsessed neurodivergent high school senior who is forced to confront the unbearable weight of his own unrealistic manic expectations. I Like Movies is an empathetic but still stark character study that almost perfectly encapsulates the ways in which it's sometimes the dreams we pursue that reveal themselves to be more maladaptive coping mechanisms, ways to remove ourselves from and avoid the ardors of reality. And given its subject, I guess nobody would be particularly surprised that it struck a chord with me on a very personal level. But it's the unsparing quality of Levick's approach to telling this sort of story, where unlike the vast majority of movies that are effectively about film, about the love of film, about obsession and escape into film, that is not romantic, is not some sideways love letter to film. That's what gives it its exceptional weight and impact, even to the extent that, I must be honest, I didn't really enjoy watching the film at all because I was often so consistently reminded that, holy shit, that's me. That kid is me, or that kid was me, and it was not a portrait of that person that I wanted to see, but I realized how wonderful a job Levick had done of making a compelling drama that I needed to see, in spite of my own tendency to avoidance. So, of course, when I realized that not one but two new films directed by the same Chandler Levack were getting stateside releases this past weekend, a double feature was pretty much set in stone, even if I had to cheat a little, because while one of those films, Mile End Kicks, is seeing a limited theatrical release, the other, Roommates, which is only directed by Levick, came out on Netflix. And that's its own can of worms, given Netflix's recent decision to die on the sword of revitalizing the career of sexual predator Louis C.K. of all people. So while I don't think I can safely legally tell people to break the law, I can definitely be a fucking smartass and satirically tell you that sometimes I think torrenting is warranted. But let's get right back on track with Mile End Kicks and Roommates, which together make for a rather fascinating spiritual trilogy of sorts with I Like Movies, given that, just like with Chandler Levick's debut film, both of these movies, one the more personal, the other more a job for hire under Adam Sandler's Happy Madison production company. Together, all of them are coming-of-age stories. Mile End Kicks kicking things off with Barbara Ferreira as a 24-year-old music journalist, Grace Pine, who, after suddenly quitting her job as a regular online columnist for a trendy indie and alternative rock magazine, settles in Montreal against the recent period backdrop of its bohemian indie music and DIY art scene in the year 2010. Stewing in the same waters that had either given birth to or nurtured popular, now globally recognized acts as diverse as Godspeed You Black Emperor and Arcade Fire and Metric and Grimes, to name only a few, Pine hopes to write a 33 and a third book dedicated to an under-recognized early pilgrim to the Montreal underground, the Canadian-born singer-songwriter Alanis Morissette, specifically focused on Morissette's breakthrough Jagged Little Pill album. Ironic, given that, as Pine herself writes throughout the movie, Jagged Little Pill was an album that Morissette was only able to make when her drive to not be pigeonholed as a pop queen effectively meant being dropped from her Canadian label and uprooting to the indie alternative mecca of Los Angeles in the mid-90s. Seems like the grass is always greener somewhere, and that there are practically a million epicenters of true rock and roll and boundary-pushing music that are really everywhere and at every time, because as Levick takes pains to stress, with the same non romantic, naturalistic, low keyed approach that served her so well with I Like Movies. The world that Pine hopes to escape to doesn't really exist. When she moves to Montreal, sure, she's lucky to discover that the room she's renting is owned by a cool Quebecois DJ whose no labels boyfriend is also the drummer in a locally popular band. She gets to schmooze and meet all of these hip people, but this is not the world of the breakthrough artist. This is the world of something that is repeatedly stressed throughout the movie, both by Pine in her writings rather romantically, and other characters without any hint of romance attached to it. This is the world of the people who make art until they have to get real jobs or go back home. And it would be one thing if that was just the formulaic content of this story, the basic cautionary tale setup, except that Levick just has this remarkable facility with getting us to understand why her young characters are so enthralled with what they love, be it film or music, but almost entirely through understated observation, without giving us a truly heightened romantic gaze that leads us to exactly share in what is keeping them stuck in that place of arrested development, in that desperation to escape reality, that avoidance. Before leaving for Montreal, we do get a glimpse into Pine's bedroom, where we do see prominently featured a poster for Cameron Crowe's own seminal rock coming-of-age story, Almost Famous. And yet this is an illusion that could not help but perfectly underscore the type of gaze that Levick brings to her camera that is not reflected very prominently by the very text that both Levick and her heroine are taking inspiration from. Where one is highly stylized and sensual and replete with a perfect period soundtrack, Mile End Kicks is sometimes showing us something cool, but rarely in a picturesque manner. It shows Pine's transformation from being able to find this place and these people to put on a pedestal, to serve as her maladaptive means of escape from things she doesn't want to confront, but Levick forces us to largely see Pine rather than see through her eyes, to sit with the discomfiture of wry, witty lines that sound too much like something hipsters imagining themselves as the stars of their own coming-of-age journey, trying to say something wry or witty. To stay with the discomfort of only being able to see Pine avoid reality without really understanding what it is about it that is so consuming for her. This goes for people just as well as scenes, especially when it comes to Pine's infatuation with a local rock group frontman named Chevy, played by Stanley Simmons. From the very sequence in which Levick shows Pine seeing Chevy for the first time, watching him play his music on stage, there is an almost shocking disjuncture between how clearly attracted to him Pine already is and how little Levick gives us as an audience to see what she sees, to hear what she hears, so that instead, it's just really painfully obvious that this guy is just a pretentious dickhead and honestly a mediocre indie rock musician at that, and that it would be obvious except for the very thing that appropriately Almost Famous romanticizes, but Mile End Kicks does not, which is the perverse incentives that come with the desperate need for escape, for validation, especially the validation of girls and younger women by men that they see as like a mana for their own malnourished spirits that have more often than not been malnourished by the really shitty sexist society they live in, and more frankly, as also becomes a very stark and heavy theme of Mile End Kicks, the deliberate and odious exploitation of girls and women by men in those very scenes. In other words, Levick gives us the infatuated rock coming-of-age story, but takes away the male gaze that leans upon the romanticization and thus the problematic normalization of that kind of of maladaptive daydreaming, that validation seeking from what are, in fact, no matter how nourishing the art that comes out of it can be at a personal level, does not translate to solid social foundations, to mutually beneficial relationships, or, especially in the case of women, the centering and empowering of one's own romantic potential, one's ability to not simply be validated by the thing we love, but to fully realize within ourselves, within our spirits, what is already there that can be comparable to the things we hold so dearly, can be as rich and as self nourishing to us, even again, especially in the case of women, after the worst wounds one can fathom have been inflicted against us by individuals who use that very thing we love as a way to take advantage of us. I'm giving Mile End Kicks a highly affirmative 3.5 out of 5 by continuing with coming of age stories. Levick has proven with this sophomore effort that she can still put a distinct, emotionally heavy spin on well-trod pop film territory, which makes it an all the more ironic companion to Levick's first US production, Roommates. Written by Saturday Night Live alums Jimmy Fowley and Shara O'Sullivan, and starring Sadie Sandler, yes, the daughter of producer Adam Sandler, as a friendless college freshman named Devin, whose naive belief that the key to her social flowering will come from befriending and rooming with a wild bad girl in the form of Celeste, played by Chloe East, instead leads to a chaotic battle of wills as the basic dysfunctions of sharing a living space boils over into mutual suspicion, distrust, and then sabotage. I'm not about to tell any of you out there that there's much in the way of an imperative to see Roommates. Like most Happy Madison comedies, the production is very basic. Adam Sandler's penchant for fast-tracking simple boilerplate concepts into opportunities to either go on vacation while cutting his friends a paycheck, moving rather elegantly into shameless nepotism. The gags, both verbal and visual, are all rather obvious and maximally vulgar. There's a cynical celebrity cameo here, a cynical product placement there, and of course, what would a Happy Madison film be without just a really regressive palette of humor that still leans on the oldest crutches of ethnic stereotypes and homophobia, and an especially problematic view of gender norms and sexual mores. Look, this is a movie from the same production house that gave us the marvelous That's My Boy, a movie in which Adam Sandler portrayed a deadbeat dad who's been coasting all his life on the infamy of being that cool kid in middle school who, oh, got raped by his teacher. And if there's anything remarkable about Roommates in terms of the Sandler legacy, it's that it kind of has this queasy irony of basically being Sandler's late stage attempt to do the now done to death bad girl comedy, to give his daughter the opportunity to get just as wild and lewd as the boys. Which therefore means that it is effectively a coming of age story about the most underrepresented perspective in Sandler's entire oeuvre as a writer and producer and star, which is exactly the sorts of women characters who are more often than not both objectified as sexual objects and as the punching bags for the lowest, crudest form of humor. I will say this, though, as an actor, Sadie Sandler proves quite promising. She even really manages to clear the nepotism problem so handily that you can't help but feel all the more impressed that she's doing it in the context of this comedy that is only ever really funny in spite of itself, or, yeah, the small glimmer of a much more understated, situational kind of dramatic humor. Honestly, one of the best scenes in the film is when Devin gets to share her first kiss while dressed in a big, rotund school mascot outfit. It's a scene that's exemplary of the genuine sweetness that manages to peek through all of that typical Happy Madison vulgarian absurdism. And for a director, credit where credit is due, the elder Sandler probably couldn't have tapped a more promising talent than Levick herself, who, rather than the typical Happy Madison formula of just harshly juxtaposing sickening lowbrow toilet humor with maudlin sentimentality, brings to this highly commercial comedy project that same well-developed tact for understatement. For the most part, it still just ends up creating this kind of dissonance to the film. Like, Levick is doing exactly what she isn't supposed to be doing and taking the one dimensional, beat you over the head, obvious permanent vacation world of Happy Madison. And by understating all the moments that you're supposed to put over the top for the cheap seats, just kind of reinforcing the stiff awkwardness that comes with the paint by numbers feeling of these sorts of productions now, where it doesn't really feel like a real movie so much as it does what it is, a cheap TV movie for the streaming age. But there is just enough of it that it really starts to mold Roommates into a kind of metatextual experience. Like, we're not just watching the coming of age story of this character, which honestly works remarkably well within Levick's own oeuvre, just as much as this film is about Sadie Sandler really very ably playing a person whose own inner demons, her own worst tendencies are expressed by her neediness, by her desperate search for friendship, not for mutually beneficial reasons, but again, for validation. We're also watching a kind of metatextual coming of age story. Like, what do the Sandler daughters do when their protective father is no longer around? How do they live and grapple with the absurdly vulgar, discriminatory, and, yeah, frankly, deeply sexist world that their father has left for them? Truly like that Onion article about, like, Eminem terrified as daughter begins dating man raised on his music. Going for that understatement when every impulse should be telling you to play for the cheap seats ends up being another example of how Levick effectively puts her money where her mouth is, not just in terms of the stories she chooses to direct, but how she chooses to direct them, i.e., at least venturing to strip them of a romanticizing or objectifying male gaze. Roommates is not a very funny movie, but it does end up being a fairly watchable, kind of absurdist, vulgarian, dramatic coming of age story unto itself. Because Levick is successfully able to mute the cheapest humor to the point where the film becomes more about what is going on in her characters' hearts, and not just whatever crazy thing they're getting up to. And in so doing, even for every problematic element, she might have successfully directed the first feminist Happy Madison film. It is both literally and figuratively a movie about young women coming of age in the Happy Madison universe. The whole point is that, yeah, those Happy Madison movies are really gross and sexist, but they aren't really that far off from the way the world actually is for girls and women, so maybe don't clutch your pearls so hard and, like Levick, take a stab at the idea that there's more going on underneath that obvious vulgarity that we're not appreciating, or at least maximalizing to the fullest extent from an artistic perspective. I give it a 3 out of 5. With that, I'm getting out of here. Thank you so much for sticking through this whole video, and please don't be a stranger to shouting out in the comments. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? Otherwise, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new movie diary. I'm going to catch you guys next time.